Hello, and welcome to my summary and commentary of Part 5 of the introduction of Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. This is a fairly short section, and there's two important points here. He further describes the ahistoricity, the ahistoricness of the classical culture, and then he compares and contrasts, mostly contrasts, Western and classical conceptions of mathematics, and to a lesser extent, some scientific concepts. So let's get into it. So he begins by discussing how Homeric Greece and Vedic India burnt their dead, and he says it was such a sudden change from burial to burning that it must have had a psychological cause. And he may be right there. I mean, it sounds plausible to me. I mean, who knows at the very end of the day? But that does sound correct to me. And I'd like to compare it with post-World War I England, or I think mostly just English society. I don't think this reached the United States just yet. But right after World War I, cremation became very popular in England. Burial really fell out of favor. And even to this day in the English-speaking lands, for instance, I know my father plans to be cremated when he passes away. And, I mean, I have no idea what I'll do with myself, whenever that day comes, what I'll have somebody else do with me, obviously. But so this is very common now, actually, in American and English society to get cremated. And I do believe that most people think this was because of the psychological trauma of World War I, primarily that you have kind of the best and the brightest of England at that time, the old gentry, the people who built the British Empire, and they're all wasted in these just shithole trenches in France and Belgium and everything, and it's just incredibly regrettable. And their bodies were just mangled by all the industrial, these new methods of warfare and everything, shrapnel, things like that. So English society turned away from burial and towards cremation, and that's where we are today. So at this point, are we more similar to the classical culture in that respect, or are we still more similar to the true Faustian culture, the true Western culture? Or is this just emblematic of Western culture entering its Fellahin period? So those are all some interesting questions, and an interesting contrast with the Vedic India and the classical Greek burning their dead instead of burying them. So then the next point, he uses the Iliad as a bit of evidence for this. And my volume 1 is printed by Arktos, which is a good publisher. I quite like them. In fact, I wish I hadn't tried to save a little money with volume 2 by going with some cut-rate publisher, because I'm sure Arktos would have had some good footnotes. But they've got note 10 here, where they do discuss some counter-evidence from the Iliad. And the main counter evidence is that Hector was buried. So, there's some evidence that some people may have been buried. Now, on the other side, maybe you say, well, he was Trojan. They weren't really Greeks. Like, these were probably maybe Hittite peoples. Probably spoke some Anatolian dialect. Anatolian is a language family that most linguists think broke from Proto-Indo-European before it was Proto-Indo-European. So in that pre-Indo-European period, in the nomenclature of linguistics, pre is going to be before proto with an ancient language. Anyway, so he further speaks about classical drama. There are no truly historical motives or inward evolution. So in Western drama, think of someone like Hamlet or Werther. These people have a lot of inward dialogue, a lot of this kind of self-reflection. And then you compare that to Greek drama, something like Oedipus, or Oedipus is the best example I can think of right now, where it's just fate acting upon Oedipus. There's no development of his character, really, other than the tragedy realizing itself as he discovers that he's killed his father and married his mother and carried out this destiny that was foretold for him. And that's how most Greek dramas are. It's somebody's placed in a situation, and it's a universal situation. Every person who would be placed in this sort of situation would pretty much react in the same way. And there's nothing personal about this story. There's nothing about the character itself. It's very plot-driven. It's very situation-driven. I actually like that. I think that's a good way to make stories. And maybe that's why it's more primal or more fundamental in some sense, It's the exact opposite of kind of a French cafe drama where nothing actually happens and it's just people talking about themselves and this kind of navel-gazing art that has taken over the West to a large degree, and then you just look at it in the culture broadly. I mean, all the navel-gazing and being so, these people who are now like demisexual twinks or whatever the heck they call themselves, and they're just so bored and so navel-gazing and so self-obsessed that there's no plot to their life and there's barely any character, but they're just there and they're just, So anyway, so classical drama is completely the opposite of that. There's no historical motives, there's no inward evolution of the characters, and there's no inner dialogue of the characters. And and myth is the only matter natural to classical culture, Spengler says. And you look at a guy like Plutarch, who's even writing in the imperial period, where we would expect them to, maybe be more money interested, more focused on those sorts of matters and not myth, but they're still discussing myth. And the way that he does his history in Plutarch's Parallel Lives is all mythologically based. He also asserts that there's no inward evolution in Plato's work, and I really liked what he had to say because I just thought it was pretty funny. So he says, in Plato, we fail to observe any conscious evolution of doctrine. His separate works are merely treatises written from very different standpoints, which he took up from time to time, and it gave him no concern whether and how they hung together. And I like that because I'm not a big Plato guy. Anyone who's been listening to the series knows that I'm a Nassim Nicholas Taleb guy. He had nothing but contempt for Plato. And I'm not like a huge Taleb guy now as much, but he was incredibly important in my formative years. So all of his thinking has a deep influence on my thinking, even if I'm not reading his works right now or really engaging with them. So I just really liked that because I think Plato's probably the most overrated philosopher of all time and has been a very negative impact on human culture. So it's just kind of nice to see Spengler say that. And I think that's what a lot of people like about Spengler, is him saying kind of these funny, incisive, pretty much derogatory things about other thinkers that, with good reason, a lot of people don't like these people and they don't like the influence they've had. And, Plato, whatever he was, I actually really like Harold, that's his name, Harold Bloom, I believe. I believe it's the same guy who wrote The Closing of the American Mind in the late 1980s. But he's written some very interesting essays on Plato about how Plato's actually kind of joking with like a lot of the stuff he has Socrates say. And in my reading of the Republic, I think that's true as well, because like Socrates will go off on like a 2-page harangue, or I'm not even sure the correct word, but a monologue essentially, And it's just all bogus. It is so bogus. And then at the end, and Socrates will ask his interlocutor, and he's just like, and surely this is correct. And then the interlocutor is like, oh yes, oh yes. So Harold Bloom's thing is that, like, no, Plato is setting up these straw man arguments with Socrates, and Socrates knows that they're jokes as well, because he's ending like a 2-page monologue about complete BS by being like, well, and this surely is true, don't you agree? And then his idiot interlocutor is like, oh, yeah. I mean, it's just like anybody with any level of reading comprehension, I don't know, it's going to raise some serious questions in your mind about the sincerity with which Plato is propounding these arguments. But, on the other hand, because all these Platonists have taken these stupid arguments at face value, that's the way you've got to treat Plato today. You've got to treat him as the people of these Platonic schools treat him, right? So any revisionist Plato who's actually got a lot more substance isn't that relevant to current debates. Anyway, he also discusses that Göthe is not a true representation of the classical pure present, that Göthe had this ambition to represent the classical pure present, but he never could, because he had too much of a Faustian Western mind that could never forget. And he contrasts the deep self-examination of Dante's Vita Nuova with classical work. So he's saying even at the very beginning of the Faustian Western culture, we already had a guy like Dante who has a higher degree of self-examination than the classical culture ever had. And for us today, that's not counterintuitive whatsoever, because we view it as a largely linear, developmental, evolutionary process, where, of course, somebody in 12 or 1300 is going to have a higher degree of interior development than somebody in 300 BC, to a large degree. Now, you've got a lot of anti-medieval thought in the modern world. There's a lot of people who wouldn't say anything good about a medieval person. So, and myself included in my younger years, I remember my roommate, my first year, or it was really my second year in college, but I went to college a year early and then transferred. So it was my first year at this new college, and my roommate was a really cool guy. They put us together because we were both of like a pretty philosophical bent. So he was a philosophy major. And I remember he was reading St. Thomas Aquinas, and I just had no respect for it because I was such a hardcore atheist when I was 18 years old. I was like, why are you reading St. Thomas Aquinas? This is fucking bullshit, like blah, 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 blah. I know more than this guy. It's just like so laughable looking back on it that I thought that a guy like St. Thomas Aquinas didn't have anything to teach me, man. I mean, to my eternal shame. But I just use that as an example to illustrate the kind of anti-medieval thought. So maybe a lot of people would think, yeah, maybe Dante's Vita Nuova shouldn't have more depth than something that Plato, Aristotle, Aeschylus, Aristophanes, these people wrote. So anyway, and then he says, for more than 1,000 years, they're using the same characters, these same mythological characters. From Homer to Seneca's tragedies in the Roman imperial period, it's the same stock of mythological characters. So, whereas over the Western culture, the same characters have very rarely been reused until recent decades. So maybe this is another one like Cremation growing in the English-speaking world in post-World War I until the current day, where we have an example of English-speaking at least, but maybe Western Faustian culture broadly, as kind of reverting or regressing to either Fellahin. So these are the post-civilizational people who no longer have history and no longer have culture because their culture has exhausted itself. or to some sort of classical traits, some sort of atavistic reappearance. Because think about all the sequels today, and even more than the sequels, the fucking reboots, you know? Like, where they just try to tell the same story over again, but maybe make the guy like a black woman now or something. Like, just complete nonsense, where it's like, okay, yeah, we're just gonna, like, get some social justice points and, like, tell the same goddamn story about the same goddamn person, but now they're a new gender and a new color, and it's like, it's just so fucking amazing. And now all these people who are these downtrodden colors and genders, now they're going to be able to succeed because now they've seen on the silver screen the success of Black Velma or whatever it is. So it's all nonsense. Anyway, it's just very interesting that we see this, that we are kind of regressing into these reboots and these sequels and using the same stock of characters again and again. So does it indicate that Western culture is just in its Fellaheen period already? Where we're civilized, but we no longer actually have any cultural force? Or are we regressing and showing atavistic traits of the classical culture to the extent that you believe that Western Faustian culture is some sort of evolutionary form developing out of the classical and the Magian cultures? So, just a question. And he brings up some more evidence for the ahistoricity of the classical soul with the Middens from Athens. So Middens are ancient garbage heaps. You can think of it as like the dump outside of your town, what it will be for archaeologists in 1,000 or 2,000 years. That's what Midden heaps are. So in Athens, after the Persian Wars, in the first Persian War, if I remember correctly, Athens was sacked. I'm almost certain this was in the first Persian War, but it might have been in the second. Anyway, so Athens is sacked. They have to throw out all this stuff, and they just throw it out. You know, for us, we would probably preserve a lot of the stuff, but some of the best finds for modern archaeologists have been in these Midden heaps, have been in these garbage heaps that the Athenians themselves thought were of no value. Because they were like, all right, we're just going to build the city again, you know, after the Persians have sacked us. So it's pretty interesting. And then he mentions that even by the Hellenistic period, Aeschylus and the Pre-Socratic philosophers, so the greatest pre-Socratic philosopher, I'm sorry about my enunciation, it's pissing me off, but the greatest pre-Socratic philosopher was almost certainly Heraclitus. So he's great. He's the guy you can't step in the same river twice. I have his fragments. Ian McGilchrist is all about Heraclitus. But so by the Hellenistic period, just about 300 years later, in some cases even less, the works of Aeschylus, probably the greatest of the Greek tragedians, maybe you could say Sophocles because of Oedipus and Antigone and all that, but and then the pre-Socratic philosophers, I mean, they were all partially lost within a few hundred years. So that's a very, I think, strong piece of evidence for the ahistoricity of the classical soul. But one counterexample is something I heard a few weeks ago. There's a guy who does a podcast called the Fall of Civilizations podcast. I really like it. I haven't seen all the episodes. It's not like something I'm waiting for the new episode, but when I come across them, I like them very much. So he was doing one about the Babylonian civilization. Actually, I think I looked it up just because of Spengler and John David Ebert talking about the Babylonian civilization. So anyway, he starts the episode, the Fall of Civilizations podcast, starts the episode by discussing Xenophon. So Xenophon's a fascinating guy. He's one of my favorite Greeks because he's a warrior, well, a soldier, And he's also a philosopher. He also wrote like the first work of economics. I mean, very different from modern economics, but it's where we get our word from economics is from his work. And he's also one of the only sources outside of Plato for information on Socrates. So I'm very interested. I hope to read Xenophon's works on Socrates sometime soon and to compare those with Plato's depictions of Socrates. I'm not sure how soon I'll be able to do that, but I think it would be a great exercise to compare Xenophon's Socrates to Plato's Socrates. But so Xenophon was part of a mission. A mission. I mean, that's such an anachronism to use that word. But he was part of an expedition this was the first Anabasis, if you're familiar with that term. The second and much more, really the celebrated one is Alexander's Anabasis. But so Xenophon and the 10,000, they're helping this one Persian prince who's trying to take the throne in Persia. And this is about 400 BC. So this is about 100 years after the Persian Wars. And what happens is they actually win their battles over there, but the prince is killed. So they have nothing to fight for anymore because they don't have a guy who can get on the throne with the help of these Greek mercenaries anymore. So they've got to run. They've got to run from Babylon at this point. And that's what they do, and they get to the Black Sea. I mean, the famous thing is, because for Greeks, the sea was everything. So the famous one is that when they saw the sea, they're yelling, Thalassa, Thalassa. Well, that would be kind of an Attic way to say it, but I believe they would have said Thalata, Thalata. So, anyway, but that's the famous thing, the sea, because they finally got up to the Black Sea, and could get back home to Greece. So I think it would be a great movie, them trying to cut tail up through Babylon, up through Anatolia to get to the Black Sea so that they could survive, because now the Persians are chasing them, and they don't have any leader, and Xenophon turns into one of their leaders. Anyway, while they are running away, basically, They pass these ruins, these Assyrian ruins, and nobody knows who actually built these cities. Xenophon's asking the people around. This is in his account of the 10,000 of the Anabasis. So he's asking the local people, who are probably, in Spengler's conception, Fellahin people at this point, or they're pre-cultural Magian people, so you could look at them either way. But in Spengler's conception, they're not people who have history. So they don't know anything about these ruins. But Xenophon is curious about these ruins. So I think that's some bit of a counterexample. Now, on the other hand, Xenophon didn't try to excavate these or anything. He's not like Schliemann or like Petrarch, who are two people that Spengler brings up here. So Petrarch, along with Dante and along with Giovanni Boccaccio, he's probably the greatest of the medieval Italians, medieval European, early Renaissance figures. And Spengler really commends him because he's saying, even 500 years before Schliemann, we already have somebody who's basically an archaeologist, because Petrarch is trying to collect these ancient samples and everything. So Xenophon may be a bit of a counterexample, but you don't get these people like Schliemann or like Petrarch even until you get the Western culture, this culture that really has a strong historic feeling. And another thing that Spengler brings up, he contrasts the Chinese conception of history. He just very briefly discusses it. He contrasts it with the classical ahistoricity. So the Chinese have a concept of old traces, and it's kind of frustrating for me to read it because it should be pronounced Guzi. which is fine here because it's just a different transliteration system that I'm less familiar with. So in this edition, it's spelled Kutsi, but in modern Pinyin and Pinyin was not created until the 1950s by the People's Republic of China. So there was a prior system called Wade-Giles, but I think Pinyin is a vast improvement, but that's also because that's what I learned. So anyway, so these Guzi are the old traces. So Gu means ancient or old, and then Z here means traces. And then he also speaks just very briefly about the Tao, as the main concept of the Chinese world feeling. So the same way that the Western concept is an infinite force going into infinite space, or the classical is a body and just, it does not like the infinite. The Chinese is the Tao. And this is another one where the Wade-Giles presentation can give you kind of the wrong pronunciation, because you never want to pronounce that T in this older one like an actual T in English. Because in English, as you probably hear from my accent, we pop our P's, and we do the same thing with our K's and our C's and our T's. Because the K and the C are the same sound, by and large, unless the C is being pronounced like an S. So anyway, you want to make sure you pronounce it Dao instead of Tao. There are words in Chinese that use Tao, and it's the same T as in English, but when you say Dao, it's the same T as in French. It's a French T, essentially. I mean, it's very similar. So anyway, it's just interesting. So, anyway, he's just contrasting the classical soul with the Chinese soul there, and showing that the Chinese soul has a lot more historicity than the classical soul. He also discusses Alexandrian collectors, and that they viewed the articles just as curiosities of mythological appeal, not the way that a Western or a Chinese or an Egyptian collector would view them as real historical artifacts to be learned from. And once again, he emphasizes that in the very presence of Egypt, one vast museum of strict traditions by an early time, even the Greeks or the classical peoples are right near the Egyptians and the Babylonians, who have these strong historic senses, but they don't show any historic sense. And just as in the last part that we discussed, the Greeks had adopted the Egyptian calendar and the Babylonian calendar in a very late and insufficient manner, they do the same with Babylonian and Egyptian water clocks and sundials, which again the Egyptians and the Babylonians had from a very early period. He contrasts this even further with the German mechanical clock, which he calls the dread symbol of the flow of time, another very poetic Spenglerism. And in discussing this German mechanical clock as a very deep symbol of Western culture, and our emphasis on time, and our emphasis on measurement, we can measure time down to 1,000th of a second, and the Greeks, the classical people, barely care about a time of a century. It's all the same to them. And so this leads him to the second big point of this part, where he discusses Western and classical mathematics and their different conceptions. So classical mathematics is based on magnitudes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? I mean, just how big is this number? How do we find the circumference of this circle, to be a very simple example, right? You're going to get a quantity, a magnitude for that, as opposed to the Western conception of mathematics, where we're looking for functions, we're looking for the relationships between different variables. And that's even maybe Magian, because that's algebra, strictly speaking, if we're just talking about variables, without it being a bit more complex. But you think about something like a differential equation, which I don't know much about this stuff at all. I'm not a mathematician. I really regret that I took the bare minimum of math classes back in college and everything. But, so something like a differential equation has like infinite answers depending on the boundary and initial constraints that you put in to it. So those are very interesting, that we're looking for functions, we're looking for the relationships. There might not even be like a real answer to a lot of Western math equations, but we're just trying to understand the relationships between these concepts. Whereas for the Greek, with their emphasis on the here and now and on physical bodies, it's about a magnitude, not about a function. And this is reflected again in statics versus dynamics, where the Greeks are focused on statics and we're focused on dynamics. So he uses the example in one of the footnotes of Newton's fluxions. So Fluxions, fluxions, I believe is a better way to pronounce that, certainly as an American. So, and he contrasts that with Plato and Aristotle. So Spengler basically criticizes Plato and Aristotle because they neither knew nor felt the lack of a time element in their system of thinking, which, yeah, I thought it was a pretty good criticism. And he further discusses Aristotle in particular. He says Aristotle's Entelechy, or Entelechy, I say Entelechy, it's the only ahistoric evolution idea. Now, I kind of disagree with that, because I don't think Entelechy is an evolution idea. It's a development idea. So I don't think Spengler actually understands the difference between development and evolution. So, and most people don't, okay, but this is Oswald Spengler. He should know the difference because he's very learned. So the difference here, and there's a lot of differences. I'm not going to pretend that I could compendiate all the differences between evolution and development. But for Aristotle's Entelechy, it's basically the idea of how a potentiality, a form, becomes an actuality. So it's the central concept of this first volume, at least in the way that Charles Francis Atkinson has translated the title, because he calls it form and actuality, which could also be potentiality and actuality. So Entelechy is an idea for explaining how this form, this underlying kind of Platonic form, develops into the specific actuality at any time. But that's not an evolutionary idea. That's just the development. That's the development of the plant or the human or whatever it may be. Evolution can only act by differential reproduction and through selective pressures and things of that nature. So Entelechy has nothing to do with evolution. I mean, it's tough because you're trying to compare apples and oranges to some degree. First off, I mean, you could look at it in Spenglerian terms. You could say, well, Aristotle's concept is a classical concept and evolution is a Western concept, so it's like trying to mix oil and water or something. I don't know. And it's just interesting because John David Ebert, he discusses Spengler's idea of form and actuality in the term of entelechies. He'll say, each culture has a soul, and that's kind of like its entelechy, and then it manifests itself in these various physical artifacts of the culture or events that occur in the culture. And, that's, pretty interesting and all, but it's just, I don't think entelechy has anything to do with evolution. And I think the fact that Spengler can call it an ahistoric evolution idea is very bizarre to me. I don't know. Again, I'm an English speaker in 2023, so like evolution. I mean, and there's really interesting arguments about the information problem for overcoming. I mean, there's the different hypotheses, like the RNA world hypothesis and other hypotheses, but they haven't shown very well in experiments. And the experimenters themselves have to introduce information all the time, in the sense of Claude Shannon information theory, where they're doing things in these experiments that add tons of information to help guide the RNA in a way that is more likely to yield results that show that, RNA and DNA could just develop out of some primordial chemical soup. And it's not very convincing. So there's a lot of problems with the theory of common descent, or the theory that there's no that there has been no. I don't know. It's all very, very freaking complicated, and it's such a joke that you have all these evolution like diehards who won't even consider the counter arguments to the origin of life problem, because that's a big problem. But if you look day by day, year by year, that's what's happening is evolution. So evolution on a day by day, year by year time scale is completely and totally proven. So the fact that Spengler just poo-poos evolution and actually doesn't understand it at all is very negative for our assessment of him, looking at him from 2023. Because on a day-by-day, year-by-year, century-by-century basis, evolution could not be stronger, basically. It's a very well-proven theory as a current model of how the world changes on a number of levels. Now, there's a lot of problems when we go back to the Cambrian explosion, and we go back before the Cambrian explosion, about how living things ever could have arisen, given the nature of these information problems and combinatorial explosion and all that. Now, I don't know. There's ideas of chemical evolution preceding biological evolution. I, again, am not so sure about those, but there could be strong arguments. But again, these guys actually need to engage with guys like Stephen Meyer, who they just, Stephen Meyer, this is a joke. Guys like Lawrence Krauss getting up there. I mean, this is a disgrace that I'm even having to debate this man. I mean, it's just total nonsense. You might be right. You might be right at the end of the day, but you don't have such a slam dunk argument that you can just be like, they're platforming these voices of unreason. And anyway, I disagree with, Spengler's totally dismissive attitude towards evolution, but I also disagree with like a Richard Dawkins maximal evolutionist view. I think it's somewhere in between. I haven't found it. I'll probably never will. It's a subject that interests me, but it's just something to think about of is Aristotle's Entelechy idea, does it have anything to do with evolution? I don't think it does. Obviously, I don't know the idea that well. I'm just going based on some summaries I've heard. And there are people summarizing Aristotle's Entelechy idea who do it far more in a far more insulting manner than I have. One guy on the wiki, go to potentiality and actuality on Wikipedia. Down a few is going to be Entelechy, and the guy discusses it as like a 3-ring circus of like a BS term, and it really does look like it, because like it's totally an invented term by Aristotle to sound cool, because he's like mixing together some Greek words. So I ask you, or I just recommend, you might want to check it out. So the last 2 points are very minor and just things that I thought were kind of interesting. So the first is in one of the footnotes, Spengler calls the Romanesque style and the Crusades the first symptoms of a new soul at approximately 1000 AD. So these are the two things that he views as the first symptoms of this new Western soul. And then the final thing is he ends the section by saying that world history is likely a uniquely Faustian, uniquely Western idea, and that there may never be another world history so potent as a form of the waking consciousness after Western Faustian man falls. And he contrasts this, again, with the most extreme examples, the classical and the Indian soul, which lack the image of a world in progress. So there you have it. That's my summary and commentary on Part 5 of the introduction of Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, perhaps, and in my opinion, the most interesting work of historiography ever written. And I hope you've enjoyed it, and thanks so much for your time. Have a great evening.